Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of quiet triumph and professional persistence. Hit that notification bell to join our community of people who understand that real strength often whispers rather than shouts. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their careful work matters, even when no one seems to be watching. Because sometimes, the most important victories come from those who refuse to stop observing when everyone tells them to stop looking. They called her backup Barbie, just another pretty face in a flight suit, they said, filling quotas while real pilots did the dangerous work. But when Captain Sarah Chen detected enemy movement patterns that 3 different intelligence teams had missed, she climbed into her A-10 Warthog alone and flew straight into the heart of hostile territory, saving an entire forward operating base from an ambush that would have killed over 400 coalition forces. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The pre-dawn air at Kandahar airfield hung thick with jet fuel and dust, creating a haze that blurred the distant mountains into ghostly silhouettes. Ground crews moved between the parked aircraft like shadows, their movements practiced and efficient despite the early hour. The familiar whine of auxiliary power units mixed with the distant rumble of cargo planes on the main runway, creating the soundtrack that defined life at this forward operating base. Captain Sarah Chen stood beside her assigned aircraft, running her gloved hand along the titanium bathtub that protected the A-10's cockpit. The Warthog wasn't pretty. Its straight wings and twin engines gave it an ungainly appearance compared to the sleek F-16s parked nearby. But Sarah understood what others often missed. In close air support, survival trumped aesthetics. The aircraft's ability to absorb punishment and keep flying had saved more ground troops than any precision-guided missile ever could. She completed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking hydraulic lines, control surfaces, and weapon stations, even though the ground crew had already signed off on everything. Her attention to detail went beyond standard procedure. She noticed things others overlooked: a slightly worn cable here, an unusual wear pattern there. These observations filled the margins of her maintenance logs, creating a record of the aircraft's health that extended far beyond official requirements. The rising sun painted the flight line in shades of amber and gold, revealing the accumulated wear of constant operations. Paint had faded and chipped under the relentless Afghan sun. Tires showed the stress of countless hard landings on rough runways. Everything here existed in a state of controlled degradation, maintained just well enough to keep functioning in an environment that destroyed anything not built for punishment. Inside the operations building, the morning briefing was already underway. Sarah slipped through the door quietly, taking a seat near the back where she could observe without drawing attention. The room smelled of burnt coffee and testosterone, filled with pilots who had learned to project confidence like armor. Mission slides flickered across the screen at the front, showing target areas, ingress routes, and threat assessments that everyone had seen variations of dozens of times before. Major Bradley Thompson, the flight lead for today's operations, gestured at the tactical display with casual authority. His flight suit bore the patches of multiple combat deployments, and his voice carried the certainty of someone who had never questioned his place in the cockpit. Standard patrol routes today, gentlemen. We've got convoy coverage in the morning, then overhead support for the provincial reconstruction team in the afternoon. He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they found Sarah. And Chen will be maintaining our backup status as usual. Make sure that radio works this time, Barbie. We'd hate to have technical difficulties if we actually need you. A ripple of chuckles moved through the room. Someone near the front muttered something about diversity quotas, just loud enough to be heard, but not quite loud enough to be officially acknowledged. Sarah kept her expression neutral, a skill she had perfected through 18 months of similar comments. The nickname had started her first week at the base, when she'd made the mistake of wearing her hair in a regulation-approved but distinctly feminine style. The fact that she'd graduated third in her class at pilot training, or that she'd logged more combat hours than half the room, never seemed to factor into their assessment. The briefing continued with weather reports and intelligence updates. Sarah took notes in her worn field notebook, the same one she'd carried through 2 previous deployments. While others relied on digital tablets and smartphone apps, she preferred the reliability of pen and paper. Electronics failed in the heat and dust. Paper endured. She paid particular attention to the intelligence portion, noting discrepancies between current reports and patterns she'd observed over the past weeks. The briefing officer, a young lieutenant who'd arrived just last month, described enemy activity as minimal and predictable. But Sarah had noticed subtle changes in the movement patterns around the eastern valleys. Supply trucks taking different routes. Communication intercepts showing unusual discipline in radio procedures. Small things that suggested someone was planning something larger. After the briefing dispersed, Sarah lingered near the intelligence displays, studying the overhead imagery with the focus of someone who understood that details mattered. The photos showed the familiar terrain of their operational area, rocky valleys, scattered compounds, and the thin ribbons of roads that connected isolated communities. But something felt different about the latest batch. The absence of normal activity in certain areas. The unexpected presence of vehicles where none should be. Lieutenant Foster, the intelligence officer, noticed her scrutiny and approached with barely concealed irritation. "Something unclear about the briefing, Captain." His tone suggested that any confusion must be on her end, not his. Sarah pointed to a section of the imagery. "These compounds here showed normal activity patterns last week. Now they're empty. And these vehicle tracks suggest movement toward the restricted valley, but there's no mention of it in the threat assessment." Foster glanced at the images dismissively. "Seasonal migration patterns. Happens every year when the poppy harvest ends. The locals move around looking for work. Nothing tactical about it." He turned away before she could respond, already moving on to what he considered more important tasks. Dismissal was familiar, but it still stung. Sarah had learned that her observations carried less weight than identical comments from her male colleagues. She'd watched junior officers receive praise for insights she'd voiced days earlier. The pattern was as predictable as it was frustrating, but fighting it directly only reinforced their perception of her as difficult or emotional. Outside, the flight line had come fully alive with the business of war. Maintenance crews swarmed over aircraft, preparing them for the day's missions. Weapons specialists loaded ordnance with practiced efficiency. The concrete radiated heat, even in the early morning, promising another day of brutal temperatures that would push both humans and machines to their limits. Sarah walked past the line of F-16s where Thompson and his flight were conducting their final preparations. The sleek fighters drew photographers and visiting dignitaries like magnets, their swept wings and bubble canopies embodying everything people imagined when they thought of modern air combat. The pilots posed occasionally for photos, their swagger as much a part of the uniform as their patches and wings. Her A-10 sat apart from the glamour, parked with the other ground attack aircraft in a section of the ramp that rarely attracted attention. The Warthog's straight wings and armor plating marked it as a tool rather than a showpiece. Its GU-8 cannon, protruding from the nose like a metallic tongue, could deliver devastating firepower to ground targets, but it would never win a dogfight or break the sound barrier. That suited Sarah fine. She had learned to find purpose in being useful rather than celebrated. While others chased aerial victories that rarely materialized in this kind of war, she studied the patterns of ground movement, the signatures of hidden weapons, the subtle indicators that separated farmers from fighters. Her expertise lay in the unglamorous work of keeping soldiers alive, even if those soldiers never knew her name. the crew chief assigned to her aircraft, Technical Sergeant Martinez, greeted her with professional respect, unmarred by the politics of the officer corps. He had been maintaining attends for 15 years and judged pilots solely by how they treated his aircraft. Sarah had earned his approval by actually listening to his maintenance recommendations and treating him as a partner rather than a servant. Everything's green, Captain, Martinez reported, wiping hydraulic fluid from his hands. That anomaly you noted in the left engine temperature has stabilized. I adjusted the fuel flow like you suggested. Should run smoother now. Sarah appreciated his attention to her observations. Martinez was one of the few people on base who took her technical insights seriously, perhaps because he'd seen too many aircraft lost to ignored warnings to care about who delivered them. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit, settling into the titanium armored seat that had protected pilots through countless missions. The instruments came alive under her touch, each gauge and display telling part of the story of the aircraft's health and readiness. Where others might see routine indications, Sarah read narratives of mechanical stress and system degradation that predicted future failures before they became critical. The radio crackled with the morning's first mission launching. Thompson's voice came through clear and confident, leading his flight through the departure procedures with the casual competence of long practice. Sarah monitored their communications while completing her own pre-flight checks, maintaining her backup status even though she'd never once been called upon to fill it. That was the joke, really. Backup Barbie, always dressed up with nowhere to go. The pretty decoration kept around to satisfy diversity metrics while real warriors did the fighting. They assigned her the least demanding missions, the milk runs that kept her flight hours up without risking their token female pilot. The fact that she'd volunteered for more dangerous assignments, only to be told they were fully staffed, had become another source of amusement, but Sarah had learned to use their dismissal as camouflage. While they focused on maintaining their image as combat pilots, she studied the battlefield with the patience of a hunter. Every flight, even the routine patrols they assigned her, became an opportunity to gather intelligence. She mapped patterns, invisible to those who saw only what they expected to see. She noticed changes that others dismissed as irrelevant because they didn't fit conventional threat models. The afternoon patrol route took Sarah over the eastern sector, a patchwork of valleys and ridgelines that stretched toward the Pakistani border. She flew at 8,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough to maintain visual contact with the ground. The A-10 responded to her touch with the familiarity of a well-worn tool, its twin turbofans humming steadily despite the thin mountain air below her. The landscape told stories to those who knew how to read them. Goat trails that had been used for centuries now showed fresh motorcycle tracks. Compounds that should have been bustling with daily activity sat empty under the harsh sun. Water sources that typically attracted shepherds remained undisturbed. Each absence was as significant as any presence, creating a pattern of avoidance. That suggested something was being planned. Sarah keyed her radio to report the observations. Overwatch 3 to base, noting unusual lack of civilian activity in grid squares 27 through 29. Requesting permission to extend patrol for detailed reconnaissance. The response came back immediately, tinged with barely concealed annoyance. Negative, Overwatch 3. Maintain assigned patrol route. Your sector shows green on all threat indicators. No deviation authorized. The air controller's tone suggested he had better things to do than humor her paranoia. Sarah acknowledged the order without argument, but she engaged her targeting pod anyway, recording high-resolution imagery of the empty areas for later analysis. The pod's infrared sensor revealed what visual observation couldn't. Heat signatures in buildings that appeared abandoned. Vehicle engines that had been recently running despite no visible activity. Disturbed earth that suggested something had been buried or concealed. She methodically documented each anomaly, creating a digital record that would survive even if her verbal reports were dismissed. 2 hours into the patrol, she spotted movement near a compound that intelligence had marked as abandoned. Through her targeting pod, she could see men loading boxes into a truck, their movements hurried but organized. The boxes were the wrong shape for agricultural products, too carefully handled to be construction materials. She zoomed in, capturing every detail as they covered the cargo with tarps and scattered hay over the top. Overwatch 3. Observing suspicious loading activity at grid 3158. 6 military-age males, 1 vehicle, unknown cargo. Requesting permission to maintain surveillance. Sarah kept her voice clinical, professional, free of the excitement that might mark her as overreacting. The operations center took longer to respond. This time, when the answer came, it was from Major Thompson himself, who had apparently returned from his morning mission. "Chen, those are farmers moving supplies. We've seen it 100 times. Stop jumping at shadows and maintain your patrol." Pattern. That's an order. His dismissal carried the weight of command authority, but also something else, a satisfaction in putting her in her place. Sarah could picture him in the operations center, surrounded by other pilots who would nod along with his assessment. Backup Barbie seeing threats in farmers. What did they expect when they put women in combat aircraft? She maintained surveillance for another 30 seconds, long enough to see the truck depart toward the restricted valley. The same valley where she'd noted unusual vehicle patterns. The same area showing decreased civilian activity. The pieces were forming a picture, but it was one only she seemed able to see. She marked the imagery files and continued her patrol, following orders while building her own intelligence database. The sun reached its zenith, turning the cockpit into a greenhouse despite the air conditioning. Sarah sipped water through her hydration tube, maintaining the steady alertness that separated professional pilots from weekend warriors. Her back ached from the ejection seat. Her neck hurt from constantly scanning the sky and ground. But she had learned to embrace the discomfort as part of the job. Unlike some pilots who complained about anything that detracted from their self-image as warriors, near the end of her patrol, she encountered 2 shepherds moving their flock across a hillside. This was normal activity, the kind of scene that intelligence officers pointed to as evidence of returning stability. But Sarah noticed details that didn't fit. The shepherds were too young, too well-fed. Their clothes were too new. They moved with the alertness of soldiers rather than the patient plodding of men who spent their lives following sheep. She captured more imagery, zooming in on their faces and gait. One of them looked up at her aircraft, shading his eyes with a hand that bore the calluses of weapon handling, not shepherd's crooks. He said something to his companion, who glanced upward briefly before returning his attention to the flock. They were playing roles, but for whose benefit? The return flight to Kandahar took her past Forward Operating Base Chapman, a smaller installation that housed special operations units and intelligence personnel. The base sat in a valley, surrounded by hills that provided excellent observation points for anyone interested in monitoring arrivals and departures. Sarah had always considered it vulnerable, despite the defensive positions and surveillance systems. As she flew overhead, she noticed new construction on the eastern hillside. Officially, it was a cellular tower being installed by a local telecommunications company. But the foundation was too robust for a simple tower, and the access road showed signs of heavy vehicle traffic, inconsistent with civilian construction. She added it to her mental map of anomalies, another piece of a puzzle that others refused to acknowledge existed. Back at Kandahar, she landed to find the flight line busy with the controlled chaos of shift change. Aircraft were being refueled and rearmed for evening missions. Pilots gathered in small groups, sharing stories and maintaining the social hierarchy that defined military aviation. Sarah taxied to her parking spot, noting the empty spaces where Thompson's flight should have been. They were running late, probably showboating for someone. Instead of maintaining scheduled discipline, she completed her shutdown procedures while ground crews swarmed the aircraft. Sergeant Martinez was already there, running his experienced hands over hydraulic lines and checking for battle damage that Sarah might have missed. He found none, as usual. Despite the dismissive attitudes of other pilots, Sarah flew with a precision that minimized wear on the aircraft. She understood that taking care of equipment was part of taking care of people. The debriefing room was nearly empty when she arrived. The intelligence officer on duty, a different lieutenant from the morning shift, accepted her imagery files. With polite disinterest, he would catalog them according to procedure, file them in the appropriate database, and probably never look at them again. Sarah had learned not to expect follow-up questions or requests for clarification. Her observations went into the system and disappeared. Like messages in bottles thrown into an electronic ocean dot, she spread her maps on an empty table in the corner, adding new annotations to her growing collection of pattern analysis. The restricted valley now showed multiple indicators of activity. Vehicle movements followed routes that avoided standard observation points. Communication patterns suggested coordination between groups that supposedly had no connection. Construction projects appeared in locations that made no commercial sense. But perfect tactical value. Captain Lisa Murray entered the debriefing room, still wearing her flight gear from a close air support mission. She was one of the few female pilots at the base, flying F-16s with the kind of aggressive competence that earned respect even from skeptics. She glanced at Sarah's maps with professional curiosity, recognizing the work of someone who took intelligence. Gathering seriously, still tracking ghosts, Chen? Murray's tone was neutral, neither mocking nor supportive. She had learned to navigate the boys' club by becoming one of them, adopting their swagger and dismissing anything that might mark her as different. Her strategy had earned her a seat at the table, but at a cost Sarah wasn't willing to pay. Sarah indicated the pattern of movements on her overlay. These aren't ghosts. Someone's preparing something in the eastern valleys. The indicators are subtle but consistent. Prepositioning of supplies, communication discipline, avoidance of known surveillance patterns. It's textbook preparation for a major operation. Murray studied the annotations more carefully, her expression thoughtful. Sarah had seen this before, the moment when another professional recognized the validity of her analysis, followed immediately by the calculation of whether acknowledging it was worth the social cost. Murray's conclusion was predictable. Interesting theory. But intelligence says the threat level is minimal. They have access to resources we don't. Sometimes patterns are just coincidences. The dismissal was gentler than what Sarah usually received, but it still represented the same fundamental problem. In a system that valued conformity and consensus, her observations challenged comfortable assumptions. It was easier to maintain the status quo than to consider possibilities that might require changes in strategy or acknowledgement that someone outside the inner circle had seen something important. Thompson's flight returned as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. They landed with the theatrical precision of pilots who knew they were being watched, their formation tight and their radio calls crisp. Sarah observed from the operations building as they taxied past her position, their aircraft showing the kind of wear that came from aggressive flying rather than combat necessity. During the evening briefing, Thompson regaled the assembled pilots with stories of their minor engagement with suspected insurgents. 2 vehicles destroyed, no friendly casualties, mission accomplished. The other pilots listened with appropriate attention, reinforcing the narrative that real warriors flew fighters and shot at bad guys. While support aircraft circled uselessly overhead, Sarah noticed discrepancies between Thompson's account and what she'd observed from her patrol route. The timing didn't match. The location was wrong. But correcting him would only reinforce her reputation as difficult, so she remained silent. She had learned that truth was less important than perception in the social dynamics of military units. That night, She returned to her quarters and spread her accumulated intelligence across her small desk. The patterns were becoming clearer, more urgent. Someone was preparing for a major operation, using the coalition's predictable patrol routes and dismissive intelligence assessments against them. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, built from dozens of small observations that painted a larger picture. She compiled her findings into a detailed report, knowing it would likely be filed and forgotten like all the others. But documentation mattered. When the inevitable happened, when the enemy's plan became reality, there would be a record showing that someone had seen it coming. It was cold comfort, but it was all she had. The pre-dawn darkness held a different quality 3 days later as Sarah prepared for another patrol. The stars were obscured by high clouds that promised weather changes, and the air carried the metallic taste of approaching storms. She performed her pre-flight inspection by headlamp, checking each component with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small details could cascade into catastrophic failures. Martinez handed her the maintenance log, pointing to an entry he'd made during the night shift. "Found something interesting when I was reviewing the engine data, Captain. You know those temperature fluctuations you've been tracking? They match the atmospheric pressure changes from those valleys you keep photographing. Almost like the engines reacting to terrain features before we consciously register them." Sarah studied the correlation, recognizing another piece of subtle information that most would dismiss as coincidence. She thanked Martinez and made a note to cross-reference engine performance data with her terrain analysis. If the aircraft itself was detecting environmental anomalies, it added another layer of validation to her observations. The mission briefing that morning included a visiting intelligence analyst from Bagram Air Base, Major Rebecca Harrison, who specialized in pattern analysis for insurgent activities. Sarah listened carefully as Harrison described new software that could predict enemy movements based on historical data. The presentation was polished, full of statistics and algorithmic confidence, but it relied on the assumption that enemy behavior remained consistent over time. When Harrison finished, Sarah raised her hand. "Major, your model assumes static behavioral patterns. But what if the enemy has specifically adapted to counter our predictive analysis? What if they're deliberately creating false patterns while hiding their real intentions?" Harrison's smile was condescending. "Captain, these algorithms are based on thousands of data points and validated methodology. I think we can trust the analysis over intuition." The pause before the last word carried weight, reinforcing the stereotype that women relied on feelings rather than facts. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her personal workspace, a cramped office she'd claimed in an unused section of the operations building. The walls were covered with maps, overlays, and printed imagery that told a story visible only to her. She'd been tracking vehicle movements for weeks, creating a database that went beyond simple location plotting. Each vehicle had characteristics, speed patterns, stop durations, route preferences. She'd identified 17 different trucks that appeared to be civilian transport, but showed behavioral anomalies. They stopped at coordinates with no apparent significance. They traveled at speeds that suggested heavy loads despite appearing empty. They avoided certain roads on specific days, creating patterns within patterns. She opened her laptop and began entering the morning's observations, adding to a spreadsheet that had grown to thousands of entries. Each row represented a data point that seemed insignificant in isolation. Together, they painted a picture of coordinated preparation that official intelligence assessments consistently missed or dismissed. The pattern crystallized as she added the latest imagery from her patrol. The 17 trucks weren't random civilian vehicles. They were a supply network operating in plain sight. Their routes, when overlaid on a topographical map, created a distribution system centered on the abandoned compounds she'd been monitoring. The stops that seemed meaningless were actually transfer points, locations where cargo could be cached without attracting attention. She traced the routes backward, looking for origin points. 3 locations emerged as primary sources, all in areas that coalition forces considered secure. Someone was moving materials from inside the green zone to staging areas in the valleys, using the coalition's own security assumptions as cover. The operation showed patience, discipline, and understanding of coalition intelligence methods. Her analysis was interrupted by a knock on the door. Lieutenant Foster entered without waiting for permission, his expression showing irritation at finding her workspace transformed into what he clearly considered an amateur intelligence center. "Captain Chen, I need to remind you that intelligence analysis is not part of your duty description. This kind of unauthorized activity could be seen as overstepping your role." Sarah gestured to her findings. "Lieutenant, I've identified a coordinated supply network operating under our surveillance. These movement patterns indicate that you have too much free time," Foster interrupted. "We have trained analysts and sophisticated software handling threat assessment. Your job is to fly when told and provide air support when requested. Nothing more." He glanced at her maps with obvious disdain. "I'd suggest you focus on your actual responsibilities before someone questions whether you're suited for your current position." The threat was subtle but clear. Step out of line, and even her relegated role as backup pilot could be taken away. Sarah nodded without expression, waiting until Foster left before returning to her analysis. She'd learned that direct confrontation only reinforced their preconceptions. Better to work quietly, building an unassailable case that would eventually force acknowledgement. She cross-referenced the supply network with communication intercepts from the past month, looking for correlations. The encrypted radio traffic that intelligence had dismissed as routine showed spikes that coincided with truck movements. Someone was coordinating the logistics through coded messages hidden in normal chatter. The encryption wasn't sophisticated. It didn't need to be when no one was looking for it. The weather began deteriorating in the afternoon, forcing her to cut her patrol short. As she flew back through thickening clouds, she noticed something that made her circle back despite the conditions. A convoy of coalition vehicles was traveling through the valley she'd identified as a likely ambush point. They were following standard procedure, but standard procedure assumed the enemy hadn't spent weeks preparing specifically for this route. She tried to raise the convoy on the radio, but the weather was interfering with communications. Through breaks in the clouds, she could see them approaching the narrow section where the road curved between 2 ridges. Her threat receiver remained quiet, no active radar, no missile locks. But she'd learned that the absence of electronic signatures could be more dangerous than their presence. Banking hard, she descended through a gap in the cloud cover, using terrain features to mask her approach. If hostile forces were positioned on those ridges, they'd be watching for aircraft from predictable directions. She came in low from the east, skimming the valley floor with her targeting pod active. The infrared display showed what visual observation couldn't: heat signatures and positions that commanded the convoy route. She counted at least 12 separate positions, all carefully concealed and showing the discipline of fighters who knew how to avoid detection. They weren't using any electronic equipment that might trigger coalition sensors. This was old-school ambush preparation, relying on patience and positioning rather than technology. The convoy would enter the kill zone in less than 5 minutes. Sarah pulled up sharply, climbing back into the clouds while formulating a plan. Official channels would take too long, mired in verification procedures and skepticism about her assessment. The convoy needed warning now, before they committed to the fatal funnel of the ambush site. But acting outside authorization could end her career, especially given her already marginal status. She thought about the soldiers in those vehicles, unaware of the danger waiting for them. They trusted that intelligence assets would detect threats, that patrol aircraft would spot ambushes, that the system designed to protect them actually worked. They didn't know that system had blind spots created by arrogance and dismissive attitudes toward those who saw patterns others missed. Sarah keyed her encrypted command frequency, knowing the operations center would record every word. Kandahar. Control, Overwatch 3. Priority traffic. Detecting multiple heat signatures and ambush positions along Route Copper. Convoy Delta 47 approaching kill zone. Recommend immediate halt and reroute. Static filled her headset for several seconds before the watch officer responded. Overwatch 3, Kandahar Control. Negative contact on our threat boards. Route Copper shows clear. State nature of heat signatures. 12 plus dismounted personnel in concealed positions overlooking convoy route. No electronic emissions, but positioning indicates planned ambush. Convoy will enter kill zone in approximately 3 minutes. Sarah maintained her orbit above the cloud layer, watching her fuel gauge while calculating how long she could remain on station. Stand by, Overwatch 3. The controller's voice carried the tone of someone following procedure rather than processing urgent information. Sarah could picture the scene in the operations center. The duty officer checking screens that showed no threats, consulting with supervisors who trusted technology over human observation, debating whether to act on information from their least credible source. Through gaps in the clouds, she caught glimpses of the convoy continuing its steady progress toward the ambush site. The vehicles maintained proper spacing, gunners scanning their sectors, everyone following the tactics that worked when the enemy played by predictable rules. They had no idea they were driving into a carefully prepared trap. Major Thompson's voice cut through the static. "Chen, this is Thompson. I'm looking at the same sector on our surveillance feeds. Nothing there but rocks and goat trails. You're seeing heat shadows from the sun on the cliff faces. Return to base immediately." "Sir, I've visually confirmed. Human signatures and fighting positions. The pattern matches classic L-shaped ambush configuration. The convoy is following a route we've used dozens of times without incident," Thompson interrupted. "You're creating panic over nothing. Again, return to base." "That's a direct order." Sarah checked her chronometer. 2 minutes until the convoy entered optimal engagement range for the ambush. She switched to the convoy's tactical frequency, hoping to reach them directly. "Delta 47, this is Overwatch 3. Recommend immediate halt. You have hostile forces positioned ahead." A different voice answered, younger and uncertain. "Overwatch 3, Delta 47. We're showing clear on all sensors. Control shows no threats. Confirm your last?" Before she could respond, the command frequency erupted with Thompson's fury. "Chen, you are violating direct orders and chain of command. Cease transmission immediately and return to base for disciplinary action." The convoy was 30 seconds from the kill zone. Sarah could see the lead vehicle approaching the narrowest part of the passage, where high ground on both sides would trap them in crossfire. Once they committed to that section, physics and terrain would work against them. Armor designed to protect from roadside bombs would be vulnerable to plunging fire from elevated positions. She made her choice. Banking sharply, Sarah dove through the cloud deck, emerging below the weather at 2,000 feet. The A-10 bucked in the turbulence, but she held her course, lining up on the ridgeline where the ambush positions waited. Her finger hovered over the weapon's release as she activated the gun camera. "All stations, this is Overwatch 3. Conducting show of force pass. Recommend all units take cover." She pushed the throttles forward, dropping toward the ridge at maximum descent rate. The Warthog's distinctive profile would be unmistakable to anyone on the ground. Sometimes the threat of violence was more effective than violence itself. Aircraft roared over the ambush positions at 500 feet, engines screaming in the thin mountain air. Through her canopy, she saw figures scrambling from concealed positions, their carefully planned ambush disrupted by unexpected intervention. Some ran for deeper cover. Others raised weapons, but shooting at an A-10 with small arms was futile. She pulled up hard, climbing back toward the clouds as her threat receiver lit up with warnings. Someone below had just activated a surface-to-air missile system, painting her aircraft with targeting radar. The discipline of the ambush force broke completely as electronic emissions revealed their positions to every sensor in the valley. All stations, hostile SAM activation at grid 3274. Sarah broadcast on all frequencies. Multiple ground forces revealed. Delta 47, recommend immediate withdrawal. The convoy reacted instantly, vehicles reversing and peeling away from the kill zone as their gunners oriented toward the revealed threats. Coalition Quick Reaction Forces would be launching within minutes, drawn by the undeniable electronic evidence of enemy activity. The ambush had failed, but Sarah's actions had consequences beyond saving the convoy. Her missile warning system screamed as a heat-seeking missile lifted off from the ridge. She released flares and banked hard, feeling the G-forces crush her into the seat. The missile took the bait, detonating harmlessly behind her aircraft as she skimmed the valley floor. A second launch followed, forcing her to jink between terrain features while her defensive systems worked overtime. Overwatch 3 is defensive, multiple SAM launches, she reported, voice steady despite the crushing pressure of evasive maneuvers. Hostile forces confirmed at previously reported coordinates. The radio exploded with traffic as the situation transformed from routine patrol to active combat. Fighter aircraft diverted from other missions. Attack helicopters spun up at forward bases. The electronic order of battle updated in real time as enemy forces abandoned concealment to engage her aircraft. Sarah's fuel warning light illuminated as she evaded a third missile. The unplanned combat maneuvering had burned through her reserves faster than expected. She needed to exit the area, but hostile forces were actively tracking her movement. Every turn revealed new threats that had been invisible moments before an F-16 flight arrived overhead, their pilot's voice calm and professional. Overwatch 3, Viper flight has you visual. We'll suppress those SAM sites. Get yourself home. She climbed toward the clouds, using the last of her flares to defeat another missile. Behind her, explosions bloomed across the ridgelines as precision weapons found their targets. The ambush force that had planned to destroy a convoy was itself being systematically eliminated. Kandahar Control, Overwatch 3, emergency fuel state. Requesting direct vector to base. Sarah's voice remained steady, but she could feel her hands trembling on the controls. The adrenaline that had sustained her through combat was fading, replaced by the reality of what she'd done. Overwatch 3, cleared direct. Emergency vehicle standing by. The controller's tone had changed completely, professional concern replacing earlier dismissal. Everyone monitoring the frequency now knew that her warnings had been accurate. The evidence was undeniable, painted across radar screens and confirmed by explosions in the mountains. Sarah landed with vapor trails streaming from her nearly empty fuel tanks, the engines coughing as they sucked the last drops from the system. Ground crews rushed toward her aircraft before the wheels stopped rolling, their usual casual efficiency replaced by urgent purpose. She sat in the cockpit for a moment after shutdown, hands still gripping the controls, processing what had just transpired. Martinez was first up the ladder, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Captain, you all right? We monitored the whole thing. That was some flying." He helped her disconnect from the ejection seat systems, noting the sweat soaking through her flight suit despite the cockpit's climate control. "Aircraft took some shrapnel," Sarah reported, her voice hoarse from the G-forces and stress. "Left engine might have FOD damage. Checked the hydraulics too. Felt sluggish during the last set of evasives." Even now, facing potential career-ending disciplinary action, she prioritized the technical details that kept aircraft flying and pilots alive. The walk across the tarmac felt surreal. Other maintainers stopped their work to watch her pass there. Expressions unreadable. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when someone violated direct orders in spectacular fashion. By now, everyone would know that backup Barbie had gone rogue, broken protocol, and engaged hostile forces without authorization. Colonel James Mitchell, the wing commander, waited outside the operations building. His face showed the controlled fury of a senior officer whose authority had been publicly challenged. "Captain Chen, my office now." He turned without waiting for acknowledgement, expecting her to follow. The corridor seemed longer than usual, each step carrying her closer to consequences she'd accepted the moment she'd chosen to dive through. Those clouds. Other officers stepped aside as they passed, some with curiosity, others with the careful distance people maintained around someone facing serious charges. Mitchell's office reflected his career. Photographs with generals, commendations for combat leadership, artifacts from deployments spanning 2 decades. He closed the door with deliberate control, then turned to face her. "Explain yourself, Captain. You violated direct orders, broke radio discipline, and initiated combat without authorization. Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you arrested. Right now." Sarah stood at attention, meeting his gaze directly. "Sir, I identified an imminent threat to coalition forces and acted to preserve life when normal channels failed to respond appropriately. 12 soldiers would be dead if I'd followed orders." "You don't know that," Mitchell shot back. "You saw heat signatures that could have been anything." Thompson checked the same sector and saw nothing. "Our surveillance systems showed clear. But you decided your judgment superseded everyone else's. The missile launches confirmed hostile presence. Sir, the after-action report will show that you precipitated an engagement that might have been avoided." Mitchell slammed his palm on the desk. "Those forces might have let the convoy pass. We'll never know because you decided to play." "Hero." A knock interrupted his tirade. His aide entered, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, flash priority from division. General Morrison wants immediate video conference. Subject is the Valley engagement." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Wait outside, Chen. We're not finished." Sarah stood in the anteroom, listening to muffled voices. Through the door, she could hear Mitchell's tone shifting from aggressive to defensive, then to carefully neutral. 20 minutes passed before the door opened again. "Inside," Mitchell ordered, his demeanor noticeably different. He gestured to a chair, the first time he'd offered her a seat. "Division intelligence just confirmed that the forces you engaged were an advance element of a larger operation. Signal intercepts indicate they plan to take the convoy then. Use captured vehicles and uniforms to attack Forward Chapman." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd known the ambush was real, but not its larger purpose. A successful infiltration attack on Chapman would have been catastrophic, hundreds of casualties, classified materials compromised, special operations exposed. Mitchell continued, his voice carefully modulated. "Your actions disrupted their timeline and forced them to reveal backup positions. Quick reaction forces engaged additional elements totaling over 60 fighters. We found weapons caches, explosive vests, and detailed maps of Chapman's defenses." He paused, studying her face. "I'm not saying your methods were correct, Captain. You still violated orders and chain of command. But Division wants a full debrief on how you identified threats our systems missed. General Morrison will be here tomorrow." Sarah absorbed the information, feeling no satisfaction in vindication. Soldiers had almost died because institutional blindness dismissed her analysis. "Sir, I've been tracking patterns for weeks. The intelligence is in my office. Movement analysis, communication correlations, behavioral anomalies. I submitted reports, but they were ignored," Mitchell finished. "I'm aware. I've been reviewing your file submissions for the past hour. Your analysis was..." He seemed to struggle for words. unconventional but apparently accurate. The admission clearly cost him. Sarah recognized the political calculations running through his mind. He'd have to explain why warnings from one of his pilots had been systematically dismissed. Questions would be asked about command climate, about why she'd felt compelled to act outside channels. "For now, you're grounded pending investigation," Mitchell said. "But you're to prepare a comprehensive brief on your analytical methods. Division wants to understand how you saw what others missed." He paused, then added reluctantly, "Good flying today, Chen." Dismissed. Sarah left the office to find the anteroom crowded with officers who suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. She walked through them without acknowledgement, returning to her workspace to begin organizing weeks of accumulated intelligence. The satisfaction she'd expected to feel was absent, replaced by exhaustion and a deeper frustration that it had taken near disaster to validate her work. Foster stood in her office doorway, his usual arrogance replaced by uncertainty. "I need copies of your movement analysis for the intelligence brief," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Division wants all source materials." "Everything's filed chronologically," Sarah replied, indicating the organized folders. "Cross-referenced by location and pattern type. The correlation matrices are in the blue binders." She didn't mention that he'd had access to all of it for weeks, that he'd dismissed it without review. As Foster gathered materials, Major Thompson appeared. His flight suit still showed salt stains from his own afternoon missions, and his expression was unreadable. "Chen, heard you had an interesting patrol." Sarah looked up from her computer, waiting. Thompson had publicly dismissed her. Warnings hours before the ambush. His credibility had taken a hit, and she wondered if he'd come to salvage his reputation or settle scores. "The convoy commander wants to thank you personally," Thompson said finally. "His gunners got a new baby at home. Would have grown up without a father if—" He trailed off, then straightened. "Anyway, thought you should know." It wasn't an apology, but from Thompson it was close. Sarah nodded once, accepting what he could offer. "Just doing my job, sir." "Yeah, well, maybe some of us need to reconsider what that job includes." He left without elaborating, but the admission represented a crack in the wall of dismissal she'd faced for so long. The next morning arrived with unseasonable stillness, the usual wind patterns disrupted by the approaching storm system. Sarah stood before a mirror in her quarters, adjusting her service dress uniform with more care than usual. The ribbons and wings on her chest represented years of professional competence that had been overshadowed by a dismissive nickname. Today might change that narrative. General Morrison's helicopter touched down precisely at 0700, the rotor wash scattering dust across the flight line. Sarah watched from the operations building as he emerged, accompanied by a full staff that included intelligence officers she didn't recognize. Their presence suggested this debrief would go beyond a simple after-action review. The conference room had been transformed overnight. Large displays showed her analytical work, movement patterns, communication intercepts. Behavioral analyses that had lived in her cluttered office now dominated the walls. Someone had taken her hand-drawn overlays and converted them to digital formats, making the patterns even more stark and undeniable. Morrison entered with the measured pace of someone who had seen enough combat to appreciate survival. He was younger than she'd expected, with the kind of eyes that suggested he paid attention to details others missed. His staff arranged themselves with practiced efficiency while he studied the displays. "Captain Chen," he began without preamble, "walk me through your methodology. Start from the beginning. When did you first notice the anomalies?" Sarah moved to the central display, her nervousness evaporating as she focused on the data. 6 weeks ago, sir. I observed changes in civilian movement patterns during routine patrols. The variations were subtle, a shepherd taking a longer route, vehicles avoiding certain times of day. Individually meaningless, but collectively they suggested Area denial preparation. She traced the progression on the map, showing how isolated observations had connected into networks of activity. Morrison's intelligence chief, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Reeves, leaned forward with interest. Unlike the dismissive attitudes Sarah had encountered before, Reeves showed the focus of a professional recognizing quality analysis. Your reports indicate you tracked 17 specific vehicles, Reeves noted. How did you differentiate them from normal traffic? Behavioral signatures, Sarah explained, pulling up her detailed logs. Each vehicle showed consistent anomalies, stop durations that suggested cargo transfer, route variations that avoided our predictable patrol patterns, speed changes inconsistent with their apparent loads. I developed profiles for each one. She displayed the correlation matrix she'd built, showing how vehicle movements coincided with communication spikes and construction activity. The pattern was obvious in retrospect, but it had required patient observation to detect initially. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but she caught him exchanging glances with Reeves. The critical innovation, Sarah continued, was correlating engine performance data with terrain features. My crew chief noticed temperature fluctuations that matched atmospheric conditions in specific valleys. It suggested concealed activities affecting local environment. Essentially, we were detecting their presence through secondary effects on our own equipment. Morrison stood, moving closer to examine the construction site analysis. This cellular tower that wasn't a cellular tower, you identified it 3 weeks before the ambush. Why wasn't this flagged as suspicious? The question hung in the air. Its implications clear. Sarah chose her words carefully. I submitted the observation through standard channels, sir. The assessment came back as civilian infrastructure development. Without authority to challenge that determination, I continued monitoring independently. Show me the submission record, Morrison ordered. Foster, standing uncomfortably in the corner, produced the files showing Sarah's reports and the dismissive responses they'd received. The general's expression darkened as he read the exchange where her analysis had been rejected as paranoid speculation from an underutilized asset. Colonel Mitchell shifted uncomfortably as Morrison turned to him. Colonel, explain to me how. Actionable intelligence from one of your pilots was systematically ignored for 6 weeks. Sir, our processes relied on automated threat detection and validated intelligence channels. Captain Chen's methods were unconventional. Mitchell's defense sounded weak even to him. Unconventional but accurate, Morrison corrected. While your conventional methods missed an operation that would have resulted in hundreds of casualties. He returned his attention to Sarah. Continue, Captain. Sarah pulled up the communication. Intercept analysis, showing how enemy forces had adapted to coalition intelligence methods. They studied our patterns as carefully as I studied theirs. They knew our surveillance focuses on electronic signatures, so they minimized emissions. They understood our patrol routes, so they moved in the gaps. They exploited our reliance on technology by reverting to analog methods. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Classic asymmetric adaptation, Reeves murmured. They used our strengths against us. The ambush yesterday was just the opening phase, Sarah added, displaying the larger operational plan revealed by captured documents. Taking the convoy would have provided vehicles and uniforms for infiltration. The weapons caches were pre-positioned for the assault team. Communications were structured to activate sleeper cells inside our green zones. The scope of the prevented catastrophe became clearer with each revelation. Morrison's staff exchanged looks that mixed professional horror with admiration for the analysis that had uncovered it. The intelligence failure would have been historic, except one pilot's persistence had prevented it. Captain Chen, Morrison said formally, your actions yesterday violated the letter of military protocol, but upheld its spirit. You prevented a massacre through individual initiative when institutional processes failed. That's a failure of our systems, not a mark against you." He turned to address the room. "Effective immediately. We're implementing new protocols, incorporating Captain Chen's analytical methods. I want her techniques taught at every intelligence school and theater. We've become too dependent on electronic collection at the expense of human observation." The vindication felt hollow to Sarah. Soldiers had almost died because her warnings were dismissed. The system that should have protected them had failed, saved only by her willingness to risk everything. But she recognized the significance of Morrison's declaration. Her methods would become doctrine, potentially saving lives for years to come. "Sir," she ventured, "I recommend integrating flight crews into intelligence collection more systematically. We're over target areas daily, seeing patterns that desk-bound analysts miss. If we created formal channels for pilot observations—" "Draft a proposal," Morrison interrupted. "I want a comprehensive plan for pilot intelligence integration. You'll work directly with Colonel Reeves to develop training protocols." He paused, studying her. "You've been wasted in your current role, Captain. How do you feel about a transfer to strategic planning?" The offer represented everything she'd been denied: respect, authority, the chance to shape military doctrine. But Sarah thought about her aircraft, about Martinez and his meticulous maintenance, about the view from 8,000 feet that had revealed what others missed. "Sir, I prefer to keep flying while developing these protocols. Maintaining operational currency keeps the analysis grounded in reality. Desk-bound planners lose touch with tactical truth." Morrison smiled for the first time. "Spoken like a true warrior scholar. Very well. You'll split duties, operational flying and intelligence development. Colonel Mitchell will adjust your schedule accordingly." The look he gave Mitchell suggested this wasn't a request. As the debrief concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by Morrison's staff, all wanting details about her analytical methods. The same observations that had been mocked yesterday were now being treated as revolutionary insights. The transformation was jarring but welcome. 3 days after Morrison's visit, the flight line felt different. Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection in the pre-dawn darkness, but now other pilots nodded in acknowledgement as they passed. The change was subtle, a straightened posture here, a professional greeting there, but it marked a fundamental shift in how she was perceived. Martinez worked alongside her, checking hydraulic pressures with extra care. "Been getting questions from other crew chiefs," he mentioned casually. "They want to know about those engine temperature correlations we documented. Seems everyone's suddenly interested in environmental indicators." Sarah smiled slightly, recognizing the ripple effects beginning to spread. "Tell them to start logging everything, even if it seems insignificant. Patterns only emerge from complete data sets." The morning briefing room was full, unusually so, for a routine patrol day. Sarah took her customary seat near the back, but this time the space around her didn't remain empty. Captain Murray settled into the adjacent chair, offering a cup of coffee without comment. It was a small gesture that spoke volumes. The intelligence briefing had transformed completely. Where Lieutenant Foster once delivered superficial threat assessments, a new team from division now presented layered analysis incorporating pilot observations. Sarah recognized her methodology in their approach, the focus on behavioral patterns, environmental indicators, and correlation matrices. "Based on pilot-reported anomalies," the briefer explained, "we've identified 3 potential staging areas requiring immediate reconnaissance. Notice how vehicle patterns here mirror what Captain Chen documented before yesterday's prevented attack." Thompson, leading the morning's mission planning, actually turned to Sarah. "Chen, you've overflown Sector 7 most frequently. What's your assessment of these movement patterns?" The question was professional, without trace of his former dismissiveness. Sarah stood, moving to display with quiet confidence. The pattern suggests supply pre-positioning, but the timing is off. These movements are too regular, too obvious. I'd recommend checking the adjacent valleys. What we're seeing might be deliberate misdirection." She explained her reasoning, showing how enemy forces had previously used decoy activities to draw attention from actual preparations. The room listened intently, some taking notes. When she finished, Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Adjust mission planning to include those adjacent areas. Good catch." After the briefing, Sarah found herself walking to the flight line with a group of pilots who would have previously ignored her. Their questions were genuine, focused on understanding her observation techniques rather than challenging them. The conversations remained professional, but the invisible wall that had separated her from the squadron was crumbling. Her patrol that morning took her over the same valleys she'd been monitoring for weeks. But now, instead of filing reports that disappeared into bureaucratic indifference, she had direct communication with the analysis team. Real-time observations were immediately integrated into the intelligence picture, creating a dynamic understanding of the battlefield. Overwatch 3, noting unusual dust patterns near Grid 4-2, she reported. Consistent with recent excavation, but no visible construction activity. Copy, Overwatch 3. We're correlating with satellite imagery now. Stand by. The response came quickly, professionally, without the skepticism that had colored previous interactions. Within minutes, they'd identified discrepancies suggesting hidden bunker construction. She marked the coordinates and continued her patrol, satisfaction warming her despite the aircraft's cold cockpit. This was how the system should work: observers and analysts collaborating to build comprehensive battlefield awareness. Her individual victory was becoming institutional change. Back at Kandahar, she found her office transformed. New computers had been installed, connected to intelligence networks she'd previously been denied access to. A sign on the door read, "Tactical Analysis Integration Cell," recognition that her workspace had become something more than a pilot's cluttered office. Colonel Reeves waited inside, reviewing the accumulated intelligence Sarah had gathered over months. "Impressive work, Captain. I've been studying your correlation methods. The way you connected seemingly unrelated data points. It's intuitive but also systematically reproducible. That's rare." Sarah moved to her maps, now digitized but still, showing her handwritten annotations. "The key is patience, ma'am. Threats don't announce themselves. They whisper in the data, and you have to listen carefully enough to hear them. Which is why we're implementing your pilot observation program across theater," Reeves announced. General Morrison fast-tracked approval. "Every flying squadron will have a designated intelligence liaison, trained in your methods. You'll be conducting the initial training." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. Her personal vindication was becoming a legacy that would outlast her individual contributions. "When do we start?" "Next week. But first, there's something else." Reeves produced an official folder. "Your actions prevented catastrophic loss of life. Division is recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The ceremony will be next month." Sarah stared at the documentation, processing the recognition she'd never sought. The medal mattered. Less than the lives saved, but it represented something important: official acknowledgement that quiet competence could triumph over loud dismissiveness. "There's more," Reeves continued. "The prevented attack would have compromised ongoing special operations. Those missions can continue because you acted when others hesitated. The operators want to thank you personally, but that's not possible for security reasons. So they sent this." She handed Sarah a simple challenge coin, unmarked except for a Latin phrase, "Semper vigilans," always vigilant. Sarah understood. The shadow warriors who operated beyond public acknowledgement recognized her as one of their own, someone who watched the darkness so others could sleep safely. That evening, Sarah flew a sunset patrol, the mountains glowing gold beneath her. Wings. The radio chatter included her call sign naturally now, no longer isolated or ignored. When she reported observations, they were received with the respect earned through proven competence. Overwatch 3. This is Dragon 6, a ground unit commander called. We're approaching the valley you flagged yesterday. Appreciate the heads up on those fighting positions. We're adjusting our route accordingly. Copy, Dragon 6. Glad to help. Stay safe down there. The exchange was routine, professional, but it represented everything she'd fought to achieve. Her observations protecting soldiers who trusted her vigilance. As she turned for home, Sarah reflected on the journey. From mockery to respect. The nickname backup Barbie had already begun to fade, replaced by recognition of her true worth. But she knew the real victory wasn't personal vindication. It was the systematic change that would prevent future intelligence failures. Tomorrow would bring new patrols, new patterns to analyze, new threats to detect. Sarah would approach them with the same quiet professionalism that had carried her through months of dismissal. The difference was that now when she spoke, people listened. And in the military, being heard could mean the difference between life and death for those counting on her vigilance. The secure video conference connected 5 forward operating bases across Afghanistan, each screen showing pilots and intelligence officers gathered around tactical displays. Sarah stood at the primary console in Kandahar, leading the weekly integration brief that had become standard procedure across the theater. Her audience included officers who outranked her, but they listened with the attention reserved for recognized experts. Last week's correlation between maintenance anomalies and threat indicators proved significant. She began highlighting data from Bagram Air Base. Captain Williams noticed unusual wear patterns on aircraft returning from northern sectors. Cross-referencing with ground intelligence revealed new anti-aircraft positions being established. We adjusted flight paths before they became operational. From the Bagram feed, Williams nodded. The temperature variations Major Chen taught us to monitor showed stress patterns consistent with weapons tracking. We wouldn't have caught it through standard channels. The discussion continued with each base sharing observations, building a comprehensive intelligence picture through collective vigilance. Sarah guided the analysis, drawing connections between disparate reports that formed actionable intelligence. This collaborative approach had replaced the isolated efforts that once characterized pilot intelligence interaction. After the conference, Thompson approached her in the hallway. His demeanor had transformed completely over the past months. "Chun, got a minute? I'm restructuring the fighter squadron's mission planning. Want to incorporate your observation protocols from the ground up. Could use your input." They walked to the planning room where Thompson spread out his proposed changes. The integration was thorough mandatory observation training, dedicated intelligence liaison positions, direct reporting channels that bypass traditional bureaucracy. It represented everything Sarah had advocated for when her warnings were dismissed. "I've been thinking about that day," Thompson said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "When you tried to warn us about the ambush. I was so convinced our systems were superior. That experience meant knowing when not to act on every anomaly." He paused. "I nearly got people killed with that arrogance." Sarah studied the planning documents, giving him time to find his words. She'd learned that transformation came easier when people could acknowledge mistakes without public humiliation. "You saved my career that day," he continued. "If that ambush had succeeded, the investigation would have shown I dismissed actionable intelligence. But more than that, you showed me what real professionalism looks like. Quiet competence instead of loud confidence." "We all learned something," Sarah replied diplomatically. "The system's stronger now because we identified weaknesses. Your squadron's integration plan will save more lives than any single action could." That afternoon, she received an encrypted message from Special Operations Command. The units she'd saved from compromise had completed a series of high-value captures. using intelligence derived from her analytical methods. They couldn't provide details, but wanted her to know the ripple effects extended far beyond prevented ambushes. Martinez found her on the flight line, performing her usual pre-mission inspection. "Major, something you should see." He led her to the maintenance hangar where crews from multiple aircraft were gathered around a presentation board. Charts showed correlations between engine performance data and threat detection across the entire wing. "We've been developing this based on your initial observations," the senior maintenance chief explained. "Turns out our aircraft have been telling us about threats all along. We just weren't listening with the right ears. We're proposing fleet-wide modifications to enhance these detection capabilities." Sarah examined their work, impressed by how far they'd taken her initial insight. Maintenance crews, often overlooked in the intelligence cycle, were becoming integral to battlefield awareness. The cultural transformation extended beyond pilots to everyone who touched the aircraft. That evening's patrol took her over valleys now mapped with precision born from months of careful observation. The radio chatter included continuous updates from ground units, using her terrain analysis to plan movements. What had once been dangerous uncertainty was now calculated risk management. Overwatch 3, Wolverine Actual, a special forces team. Leader called. "We're inserting into the valley you designated as low threat, based on your movement analysis. Appreciate the detailed work. Makes our job significantly safer." She monitored their insertion, providing overwatch as they moved through terrain she'd studied for countless hours. Every successful operation validated the methodology that had once been mocked as paranoid overthinking. Back at base, she found a package waiting in her office. Inside was a plaque from the convoy she'd saved months earlier, signed by every soldier. The inscription read, "To Major Sarah Chen, your vigilance gave us the chance to come home." We remember, such gestures had become common. Units across the theater sent tokens of appreciation, challenge coins, unit patches, photographs of families that remained intact because she'd seen what others missed. Her office walls, once covered only with maps and analysis, now displayed tangible proof of lives saved. The evening intelligence brief included a presentation from Lieutenant Foster, who had transformed from dismissive critic to enthusiastic advocate. He showed how pilot observations had increased actionable intelligence by 40%, while reducing false positives through systematic correlation. Major Chen's methodology has revolutionized how we process battlefield information. Foster told the assembled staff, "We're not just collecting data anymore. We're building predictive models based on human observation enhanced by technology, rather than replacing it." After the brief, several junior officers approached Sarah with questions about advanced pattern recognition. Their eagerness reminded her how much had changed. Where once she'd been isolated by mockery, she now mentored the next generation of warrior analysts. "Remember," she told them, "the enemy studies our patterns as intensely as we study theirs. The moment we become predictable in our methods, they'll adapt. Stay flexible, trust your instincts, and never dismiss an observation just because it doesn't fit established models." One lieutenant asked about the backup Barbie nickname, having heard rumors but not understanding the context. The room fell silent, everyone recognizing the sensitive nature of the question. Sarah addressed it directly. "Labels meant to diminish often reveal more about those who use them than their targets," she said calmly. "I focused on being too competent to ignore, rather than fighting perceptions. Eventually, results speak louder than nicknames." The assembled officers absorbed the lesson. Several female pilots present exchanged knowing looks. They'd faced similar challenges and found inspiration in Sarah's trajectory from mockery to respect. As the meeting dispersed, Colonel Mitchell appeared. Their relationship had evolved from adversarial to genuinely collaborative. "Major Chen, wanted to inform you personally, the Air Force Times is running a feature on the intelligence revolution in Afghanistan. Your work is the centerpiece. There. Calling it the Chen Doctrine, the integration of human observation with technological capability. The recognition felt surreal. From dismissed backup pilot to having military doctrine named after her, the transformation exceeded anything she'd imagined during those lonely months of ignored warnings. Also, Mitchell added, that Pentagon position Morrison mentioned, they're holding it for you. No pressure, but opportunities like that don't come often. You've earned the right to write policy at the highest levels. Sarah thanked him, her mind already on tomorrow's training evolution. Strategic positions offered prestige, but tactical application saved lives. The choice reflected the same patient calculation that had guided her throughout: substance over status, impact over recognition. That night, she walked the flight line. Alone, observing the familiar rhythms of combat operations with eyes trained to see patterns within patterns. The transformation she'd initiated was becoming self-sustaining, spreading through military culture like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Young pilots now arrived eager to learn observation techniques. Intelligence officers actively sought aviator input. Maintenance crews understood their role in threat detection. The mockery that had once isolated her had been replaced by institutional recognition that quiet competence could see what arrogance missed. The Dawn Patrol 6 months later found Sarah flying lead position in a 4-ship formation, her wingmen representing different squadrons who had requested to train under her direct supervision. The evolution from solitary observer to tactical leader had happened gradually, but the transformation was complete. Her call sign, Overwatch 3, had become synonymous with precision intelligence gathering across the entire Central Command area of responsibility. Below them, the Afghan landscape revealed its secrets to trained eyes. Sarah guided her flight through systematic observation patterns, teaching through example rather than lecture. Each pilot wore recording equipment to capture their observations, creating training materials for future generations of airborne intelligence. Collectors. Overwatch flight. Note the vehicle patterns near grid, reference 27, she transmitted. Compare current movement with baseline activity from your pre-mission study. What anomalies do you detect? The responses came quickly, her students applying lessons learned in classroom to real-world observation. They identified subtle indicators: a truck moving against traffic patterns, groups of people avoiding open areas despite clear weather, communication antennas appearing on previously unmarked buildings. Excellent work. Now correlate those observations. What operational picture emerges? Sarah guided them through the analysis process that had become second nature to her. Within minutes, they'd identified what appeared to be early-stage preparation for hostile activity. Overwatch 3, Hammer 6 requesting immediate consultation. The ground force commander's voice carried urgency. We're planning an operation based on your sector analysis. Need your assessment of terrain and movement patterns. Sarah broke from the formation, leaving her senior wingman in charge while she provided dedicated support to the ground unit. This integration between air and ground elements had become routine, replacing the rigid separation that once characterized joint operations. She guided Hammer 6 through alternative approaches to their objective, highlighting dead zones and enemy observation and natural terrain features that could mask movement. Her intimate knowledge of the area, built through countless hours of patient observation, provided advantages that technology alone couldn't replicate. Major Chen, this is General Morrison. The theater commander's voice on the command frequency surprised everyone monitoring. Outstanding work on the Helmand Valley assessment. Your prediction models proved accurate within 2%. National Command Authority sends their compliments. The public acknowledgement from such high levels would have seemed impossible when she was dismissed as backup Barbie. Now it reflected the institutional recognition that patient observation could provide strategic advantages in modern warfare. After landing, Sarah found the operations center bustling with activity. Large displays showed real-time intelligence feeds from across the theater, much of it derived from pilot observations, processed through her analytical frameworks. Officers who had once dismissed her warnings now competed to brief her on developments. In their sectors, Colonel Reeves met her at the intelligence fusion cell. "Sarah, the metrics are remarkable. Hostile activity preemption is up 60%. Coalition casualties are at historic lows. The Secretary of Defense wants to expand your program across all combatant commands." They reviewed the implementation timeline, discussing how to maintain quality while scaling the program globally. Sarah insisted on rigorous standards for instructor certification, understanding that diluted training would undermine the methodology's effectiveness. "There's something else," Reeves added, producing an official document. "Your promotion to colonel has been approved. Youngest in your year group. The board specifically cited your revolutionary contributions to intelligence integration." The oak leaves representing colonel rank would replace the gold major's insignia she'd worn for less than a year. The rapid advancement reflected recognition that transcended normal career progression. Sarah accepted the news with quiet satisfaction. Knowing the rank would provide authority to implement wider changes, that afternoon, she conducted her final training session for the current class. 30 pilots from 7 different nations sat attentively as she summarized key principles they'd spent weeks absorbing. These officers would return to their units as seeds of transformation, spreading observation methodology throughout the global coalition. "Intelligence gathering isn't about sophisticated technology or advanced degrees," Sarah told them. "It's about patience, consistency, and the courage to trust your observations even when others dismiss them. You've learned to see patterns. Now teach others to see them too." After dismissal, several students lingered with personal thanks. A British Tornado pilot mentioned how her methods had already saved lives in his squadron. An Australian F-18 pilot described using her techniques to uncover smuggling operations. Each story reinforced that the changes she'd initiated were becoming self-perpetuating. Martinez waited by her aircraft, performing his usual meticulous inspection. "Heard about the promotion, Colonel. Well deserved. Also heard you're finally taking that Pentagon position?" Sarah ran her hand along the A-10's armored fuselage, feeling the familiar rivets and battle scars. "Still deciding. Strategic planning matters, but this is where theory meets reality." "Whatever you decide, you've already changed everything," Martinez observed. "Kids coming through tech school now learn about environmental indicators and maintenance. Intelligence. Your name's in the official curriculum." That evening, Sarah attended a formal dinner honoring the intelligence integration program's success. Officers who had mocked her as backup Barbie now sought her advice on career development. The transformation in their attitudes reflected broader cultural changes within military aviation. General Morrison pulled her aside during the reception. "Sarah, I need you in Washington. Not just for the Pentagon position. We're establishing a new Joint Intelligence Integration Center. You'd be the founding director, building institutional capability across all services." The opportunity exceeded her wildest ambitions from those early days of dismissed observations. She would shape how America's military processed battlefield intelligence for decades to come. Yet leaving the tactical environment that had forged her expertise felt like abandoning her roots. "I'll give you my answer after one more operational deployment," she replied. "There are programs here that need completion, students who deserve consistent instruction through their training." Morrison smiled knowingly, still putting mission before career. "That's exactly why we need you at strategic levels. Take your time. The position won't be filled by anyone else." The next morning brought news that validated everything Sarah had worked to achieve. A massive operation targeting coalition forces had been preempted through pilot observations processed through her analytical methods. Hundreds of lives saved. Through patient vigilance rather than reactive combat, she flew her patrol route with renewed purpose, showing her wingmen how morning light revealed different details than afternoon shadows. Every observation contributed to the intelligence mosaic that kept coalition forces safe. The radio chatter reflected professional integration between air and ground elements that had become standard practice. Overwatch 3, this is Dagger 7, a special operations team called. Inserting based on your terrain analysis. Your work makes our job possible. Much appreciated. She provided overwatch. As elite forces moved through valleys, she'd mapped through countless hours of observation. Their trust in her analysis represented the ultimate validation. Professionals who operated on the narrowest margins depending on her judgment. Returning to base, Sarah found her office filled with visitors. The Air Force Times photographer was setting up for the feature article on the Chen Doctrine. Intelligence officers from 3 different nations waited to discuss implementing her methods in their services. A congressional delegation had specifically requested briefings on how one pilot had revolutionized battlefield intelligence. Through it all, Sarah maintained the same quiet professionalism that had sustained her through mockery and dismissal. She answered questions thoroughly, demonstrated techniques precisely, and shared credit generously with those who had eventually supported her vision. That night, she stood on the control tower's observation deck, watching aircraft launch for night operations. Each pilot carried knowledge she'd helped develop, applying observation techniques that multiplied their effectiveness beyond weapons delivery. The transformation from individual effort to institutional capability was complete. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached, now one of her senior instructors. "Colonel, the new class wants to know if you'll be teaching the advanced course next cycle." Sarah considered the question against competing priorities. Washington offered strategic influence. Field instruction provided tactical impact. Both mattered. But her heart remained with those who flew into danger, depending on intelligence to keep them alive. "I'll teach one more cycle," she decided. "After that, we'll see where I'm needed most." Rodriguez smiled. "They'll be glad to hear it. You know what they're calling you now? The Observer. Says everything about how far we've come from ... other nicknames. The evolution from backup Barbie to the Observer encapsulated a journey measured not in personal advancement, but in lives saved and methodology institutionalized. Sarah had proven that quiet competence could overcome loud dismissal, that patience could triumph over prejudice, and that seeing what others missed could transform military operations. As she prepared for another deployment, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her here. The mockery had been painful, the dismissal frustrating, the isolation challenging. But maintaining professional focus through adversity had created opportunities to save lives and revolutionize. Intelligence gathering. The next morning's pre-flight inspection found her surrounded by students eager to learn from the Observer. She taught them to see patterns in routine, significance in anomaly, and opportunity in patience. Each lesson carried forward the methodology born from one pilot's refusal to accept that her observations didn't matter. Sarah climbed into her cockpit, knowing that whether she eventually chose tactical instruction or strategic planning, her legacy was secure. Thousands of military aviators now understood that their primary weapon wasn't hanging from wing pylons, but residing between their ears. They'd learned to observe with purpose, analyze with precision, and act with conviction. The woman they'd called backup Barbie had transformed military intelligence through quiet persistence. She'd saved lives through careful observation. Most importantly, she'd proven that true strength didn't announce itself through volume or bravado, but whispered in the patterns that patient professionals learned to see. Her story would be taught in military academies, analyzed in strategic studies, and remembered by those whose lives continued, because one pilot refused to stop watching when everyone told her to stop looking. The victory was complete, not because she'd been vindicated, But because the system had transformed to prevent future failures, as Sarah taxied for takeoff, leading another generation of observer pilots into the morning sky, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most important battles were won not through dramatic action, but through the steady accumulation of competence that eventually became impossible to ignore. The quiet professional had prevailed, and the battlefield was safer for her persistence. The ceremony at the Pentagon took place on a crisp September morning, exactly 3 years after they'd first called her backup Barbie. Sarah stood in her dress blues, the colonel's eagles on her shoulders still feeling new. Before her sat an audience of military leaders, intelligence officials, and the pilots whose lives she'd saved through patient observation. General Morrison approached the podium, his expression carrying the weight of what they were about to announce. Today, we inaugurate the Chen Institute for Intelligence Integration, named after Colonel Sarah Chen, whose revolutionary methods have saved over 1,200 coalition lives and prevented 17 major attacks. The applause that followed felt surreal. Sarah thought back to those lonely patrols over Afghan valleys, when her observations were dismissed as paranoia. Now those same methods would be taught to every military aviator in the free world. Colonel Chen will serve as the Institute's founding director, Morrison continued, ensuring that future generations of warriors understand that the most powerful sensor in any aircraft is the trained human observer. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by young officers eager to learn from the observer. One lieutenant asked the question she'd been expecting. "Ma'am, how did you maintain faith in your observations when everyone dismissed them?" Sarah's answer came from hard-won experience. "Truth doesn't need volume to be valid. I focused on documenting what I saw, improving my methods, and remembering that lives depended on someone watching carefully. The mockery hurt, but letting it stop me would have hurt more." Later, in her new office overlooking the Potomac, Sarah received a video message that brought her journey full circle. Martinez, now a senior chief, appeared on screen with a group of maintenance crews. "Colonel wanted you to see this. We've installed your environmental detection protocols on every aircraft in the fleet. The birds themselves are helping us watch now." The integration was complete. From pilot observations to maintenance data to command decisions, her methodology had transformed how the military processed battlefield intelligence. The woman dismissed as a diversity hire had revolutionized warfare through quiet competence. That evening, Sarah returned to an A-10 squadron at Andrews Air Force Base for a final operational flight. The aircraft felt familiar despite months away from regular flying. As she completed her pre-flight inspection, young pilots gathered to watch the observer prepare for flight one more time. She took off into the setting sun, flying patterns that had become second nature through countless hours of patient observation. Below her, the landscape told its stories to eyes trained to see them. Every shadow, every movement, every anomaly carried potential meaning for those who knew how to look. The radio crackled with traffic from training, flights practicing her observation techniques. She listened with satisfaction as pilots reported subtle indicators, correlated patterns, and built intelligence pictures through collective vigilance. The transformation from individual effort to institutional capability was complete. As she landed for the final time as an operational pilot, Sarah knew her flying days weren't over, just changing. She would still fly, but now as an instructor, teaching others to see what conventional wisdom missed. The Chen Institute would ensure her legacy lived on through every pilot who learned to trust their observations despite skepticism. Walking across the tarmac, she passed a group of female pilots preparing for their night training mission. They nodded respectfully to the observer, knowing her journey had made theirs easier. She'd proven that competence transcended stereotypes, that persistence overcame prejudice, and that quiet professionalism spoke louder than any dismissive nickname. Next morning, Sarah stood before the first class of the Chen Institute. Hundreds of officers from dozens of nations filled the auditorium, ready to learn how one pilot's refusal to be silenced had revolutionized military intelligence. She began with words that would echo through military education for generations. They called me backup Barbie, just a pretty face filling quotas. But I knew that watching carefully when others looked away could save lives. Today, you'll learn to see what others miss, to trust your observations despite dismissal, and to remember that the greatest victories often come from the quietest voices. Her story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become doctrine. The transformation from mockery to respect was complete, measured not in personal vindication, but in lives saved through systematic change. If you found this story inspiring, remember that we all face moments when our contributions are dismissed, or our competence questioned. Like Sarah, we can choose to persist, to document our truth, and to let excellence speak louder than criticism. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of quiet triumph and professional persistence. Hit that notification bell to join our community of people who understand that real strength often whispers rather than shouts. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their careful work matters, even when no one seems to be watching. Because sometimes, the most important victories come from those who refuse to stop observing when everyone tells them to stop looking.